In the marble halls of ancient Rome where emperors dined on peacock tongues and senators, bathed in milk and honey, a darkness thrived. So vast, so vile, that history itself has tried to forget it. Behind the grandeur of the Colosseum, behind the parades of military triumphs and imperial glory, lurks a truth rarely spoken. It is the truth of stolen childhoods. A system of quiet, calculated horror consumed the lives of countless young boys, ripped from their homes, stripped of identity, and transformed into living possessions. They were not workers, not apprentices. They were children selected for their beauty, groomed for obedience, and subjected to lives of unspeakable degradation for the pleasure of Rome's most powerful men. Their stories have been buried beneath 2,000 years of silence, dismissed as uncomfortable footnotes in the proud pages of Roman history. But their pain was real, their humanity undeniable, and their legacy a chilling reminder of how even the greatest empires can normalize the cruelest atrocities. Today, we pull back the velvet curtain of history. We examine one of ancient Rome's darkest secrets, the systematic enslavement and sexual exploitation of young boys kept as concubines in the private quarters of emperors, senators, and the elite patrician class. This is not a tale of ancient customs or harmless cultural variation. This is a story of power without conscience, of wealth built on suffering, and of a civilization that chose to look away, while children disappeared into gilded cages. What you are about to hear may disturb you, it should, because only by facing the darkest parts of our past can we protect the dignity of our future. Only in remembering the forgotten can we honor their memory, and only by confronting the shadows can we bring light to what was lost. The year is 117 CE. Emperor Hadrian has just taken the throne, ruling over an empire that stretches from the cold cliffs of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. Rome is at its height, militarily unmatched, economically invincible, culturally dominant, but beneath that splendor, in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, a darker empire thrives, in quiet villas and marble estates, behind brocaded curtains and iron doors. A trade in human misery flourishes. Here, childhood ends at the slave market. Here, beauty becomes a curse. Here, survival often costs nothing less than the surrender of one's soul. These were Rome's boy concubines. Their names are lost, their voices silenced, but their story demands to be told. To understand how such cruelty became normalized, we must first understand the system that enabled it. Roman slavery, the engine of empire. Unlike the racialized slavery of more recent centuries, Roman slavery was primarily born from conquest. When Rome's legions crushed the tribes of Gaul, the clans of Germania, or the warriors of Britannia, those who survived were not merely defeated, they were captured, chained, sold. Boys as young as 7 were herded alongside prisoners of war, auctioned off like livestock to the highest bidder. And the wealthier the buyer, the more refined the cruelty became. In a world obsessed with control, hierarchy, and dominance, youth and vulnerability were commodities. Exotic looks were fetishized. Silence was expected. Resistance was crushed. And the Roman elite, educated in Stoic philosophy and moral virtue, looked on and did nothing. A reckoning with Rome's forgotten children. This is not simply a history lesson. It is a reckoning. When we praise Rome for its laws, its architecture, its civilization, we must also confront the rot that thrived in those same marble halls. This is the story of those the empire tried to erase, children who were never meant to be remembered. Today, we remember them. This is the hidden history of Rome's boy concubines, and this is only the beginning. Spoils of war. Rome's eastern campaigns returned with more than gold and glory. They returned with people, men, women, and children pressed into the empire's relentless machinery of labor and luxury. Among these captives, a select group of boys aged roughly 7 to 14 faced a fate darker than the mines or the fields. Chosen for beauty rather than strength, they vanished behind villa doors to serve appetites polite chroniclers dared not name. The market of body-a-slave bazaars from Delos to the Forum became theaters of cruelty. Traders inspected children like livestock, hunting for soft skin, symmetrical faces, large eyes, and slight, graceful frames. Boys from Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor fetched the highest bids prized for their exotic allure. Potential buyers pried open mouths, pinched limbs, gauged posture. The lucky were sold quickly, the rest were shuffled from block to block, each resale stripping away another fragment of identity. Erasure and remaking purchase was the start of a second conquest. New, feminized Greek names replaced their own. Native tongues were forbidden. Family memories stamped out. Grooming regimens began at once, body hair plucked or burned. Complexions kept pale with indoor confinement and toxic white lead makeup. Diets were rationed to preserve a boyish build. Some endured an even crueler mutilation, castration partial or complete, to freeze them in perpetual childhood and blunt masculine traits. Official edicts frowned upon it, yet surgeons' knives kept working in the shadows. Training for submission education came, but only in the arts of pleasing others. Music, poetry, dance, witty conversation, all rehearsed to anticipate a master's moods. Failure brought beatings, starvation, or isolation. Success earned slightly better food, finer clothes, the brittle privilege of being a favorite possession. Silk replaced rags. Delicacies replaced gruel, but golden chains remained chains. They occupied a liminal state, adored and despised, pampered, yet powerless, never free to refuse. Never allowed to own, even their own bodies. The daily performance before dawn, they rose for hours-long beauty rituals. Hair curled and oiled, faces painted, skin perfumed, bright tunics clung to slender frames. Jewelry proclaimed market value, and at times golden collars spelled out literal ownership. By day, they glided through banquets, pouring wine with choreographed grace, reciting verse, plucking the light, balancing on the razor's edge between charm and punishment. By night, the euphemisms of ancient writers fall away. Archaeology, medical treatises, and a few brutally candid memoirs reveal the truth. Systematic sexual violation, repeated until body and soul alike bore scars no silk could hide. A royal example, Hadrian and Antinous. The Emperor Hadrian's bond with Antinous is often romanticized, yet beneath the marble statues lies the same machinery. Antinous, a Greek youth of extraordinary beauty, entered Hadrian's retinue, likely around 13. For 7 years he shared the emperor's table in his bed until his mysterious death in the Nile at 19 or 20. Hadrian's extravagant grief cities founded, statues raised, divinity proclaimed cannot erase the imbalance at the heart of their relationship, a sovereign's desire and a captive boy's curtailed choice. Remembering the unremembered, these children's names were expunged, their voices silenced, their suffering dismissed as custom, yet their pain was real, their humanity undeniable. In bringing their story to light, we confront the darkest chambers of an empire still celebrated for its brilliance. We honor the forgotten, and we remind ourselves that civilization and cruelty have often walked hand in hand. The reckoning has only begun. But the illusion of consent, we must ask, what choice did Antinous really have? Could a boy taken into the emperor's inner circle ever truly give consent to becoming his lover? The power imbalance was absolute. To say no to the emperor was to risk death, to say yes was to survive. But survival in this world came at an unbearable cost. The historical Antinous remains a mystery. We have Hadrian's public mourning his grief carved in marble, immortalized in statues, but we do not have Antinous's words, his thoughts, his feelings, his truth. Like so many boys taken into the beds of powerful men, Antinous exists in history only as a mirror reflection of his master's desires, his own humanity, erased beneath centuries of myth-making. One named, thousands, forgotten. Yet, even in this tragic imbalance, Antinous was more fortunate than most. His beauty and the emperor's affection shielded him from the worst. He traveled, ate fine meals, and was remembered. But for every Antinous who dined with emperors, there were thousands of nameless boys who suffered in silence in the villas of lesser men. Their stories were never told, their pain never acknowledged, their graves unmarked. Comedy for Rome, tragedy for the boys. The Roman poet Martial, writing in the 1st century CE, gives us glimpses of this hidden world, though from the wrong angle. In his epigrams, he mocks wealthy men who surround themselves with beautiful boy slaves. He writes of their appearances, their gestures, their forced obedience. To Martial, it was comedy. To the boys, it was tragedy. Children were being forced to perform their own degradation, smiling, dancing, reciting verses while the very men who violated them laughed and applauded. The medical cost of abuse. Medieval texts from ancient Rome reveal the physical toll. Doctors like Celsus and Galen described treating boys for injuries that modern readers can only interpret one way. They wrote clinically about torn tissues, chronic pain, internal bleeding. They documented the damage, but not the cause. These were children physically broken by adult lust, treated not as victims, but as medical curiosities. Their pain wasn't a moral outrage, it was a clinical footnote. Roman law. Children as property. Legal documents strip away the final illusion. In wills and sales contracts, these boys appear not as people but as objects, listed alongside furniture, livestock, jewelry. Court records mention them only in passing. A boy who ran away, only to be captured and punished. Another, murdered by a jealous master. One more discarded, once his beauty faded, no longer valuable. To Roman law, these were not human tragedies. They were property disputes. A common contagious crime, and this cruelty wasn't confined to the palaces of emperors or the estates of the ultrich across the Roman Empire. Any man with enough money could buy a beautiful boy. For his own desires, merchants, landowners, military officers, they all participated. These boys were not just used, they were displayed. Status symbols, like fine wine or rare marble, owned for pleasure, shown off for power. The practice became so widespread that even moralists like Seneca felt the need to speak out. But their concern was rarely for the boys, it was about Roman excess, not Roman exploitation. In the East, no less cruel in the eastern provinces of the empire, where Greek culture remained strong, the abuse took on more refined forms. Boy concubines there were often trained as entertainers. They learned to sing, to dance, to play instruments. Some were even educated in philosophy and literature, expected to pour wine while quoting Plato. But make no mistake, education was not freedom. Learning only increased their value, not their dignity. They remained what they were in Roman law and society: property, Rome's forgotten children, the marketplace of suffering. Occasionally, history leaves behind a paper trail, a few fragile scraps of truth that give us heartbreaking glimpses into this brutal trade. One papyrus from Roman Egypt records the sale of a Syrian boy, aged 12. He was described as skilled in music and pleasing to look upon. The price, more than what several adult field slaves would have cost. Another document, found in Pompeii, mentions the sale of a boy trained in Greek ways to a wealthy merchant. The language is dry, transactional, but beneath these sterile words lies the human reality: children sold into sexual slavery under the full sanction of Roman law and custom. Normalized cruelty. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system was not the abuse itself, but how utterly normal it became. Wealthy Roman men would bring their boy concubines to public events, parading them like exotic pets. Poets praised their beauty in verse, comparing their faces to flowers, pearls, or sunlight. Artists demoralized them in mosaics and frescoes, forever posed in acts of submission and availability. What we now recognize as child abuse was back then a lifestyle statement, a symbol of taste, refinement, and power. The psychology of dehumanization. How could an entire society look at enslaved children and see only pleasure? The answer lies in a psychological strategy as old as oppression itself: dehumanization. These boys were not called children. They were called delicutalites, Puri boys, in the most objectified sense. They weren't seen as people with emotions or boundaries. They were status symbols, obedient pets, silent treasures. When they showed signs of trauma, depression, self-harm, escape attempts, these were not treated with compassion. Instead, they were labeled as flaws, weaknesses, moral failings, moral outrage for the wrong reasons. A few Roman voices spoke out against the practice, but rarely for the boys' sake. Stoic philosophers warned that sleeping with slave boys made Roman men soft and effeminate. Moralists worried about freeborn youth copying the gestures or clothing of concubines. The concern was not for the suffering of the slaves, but for the supposed corruption of Roman virtue. These children weren't seen as victims. They were seen as instruments of decadence, tools of temptation, not worthy of protection, but blame. War and demand. A vicious cycle. Rome's military conquests didn't just supply gold and land. They fed the empire's hunger for human bodies. As the empire expanded, more boys were captured, more markets filled, and more Roman men could afford to own them. The demand for beautiful boys even influenced military campaigns, with some generals targeting regions known for their exotic captives. Children became another form of plunder. Their homes burned, families killed, and then they were sold to the very people who caused it all. And then came the second destruction: the need to please. A lifetime of wounds. The trauma didn't end with the abuse. These boys were severed from family, culture, language, identity, then made to serve the very hands that shattered their lives. To survive, they had to adapt to perform joy while feeling despair, to smile, sing, and serve, while hiding the damage inside. These psychological gymnastics left wounds that would last a lifetime. After desire fades by their late teens or early 20s, most of these boys had aged out of desirability, and what came next was often just as cruel. Some were sold to brothels, where they faced continued exploitation. Others became household servants, kept close but as ghosts of their younger selves. A few were freed by masters, often in wills, perhaps out of guilt or affection. But freedom was complicated. A boy trained from childhood to be a sexual object did not step into liberty easily. They faced discrimination, poverty, and a society that still saw them as what they had once been: possessions. The myth of liberation of an manumission, the legal freeing of a slave, was often hollow. A former concubine had few skills beyond those that had once pleased his master. His name might be recorded, but his future remained uncertain. His trauma unspoken. His pain unchanged. And yet, we know they existed. Because sometimes, history could not entirely silence them. Because buried beneath ash and sand, in villas and bathhouses and forums, their images remain. Boys frozen in time, painted, carved, bought, sold, and forgotten. Until now. Silent stones and speaking walls across the ruins of the Roman Empire. Silence testifies. Inscriptions etched into tombs tell fragmented stories. A young slave remembered not for who he was, but for how he pleased. Grave, goodsmears, cosmetics, jewelry hint at lives centered around appearance, not identity. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved in volcanic ash, archaeologists uncovered rooms clearly designed for display and accessed small chambers adjacent to elite bedrooms, decorated with erotic artwork that leaves no doubt about their purpose. Then there's the art. Frescoes on villa walls depict gods pursuing boys: Zeus and Ganymede, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Dionysus and Impelos. To the Roman elite, these myths weren't warning tales. They were permission slips, transforming rape into romance, and predation into divine privilege. Boy concubines were sometimes named after these mythic boys, blurring the line between fantasy and real-life abuse, between gods and the men who played God with children's lives. Medicine without Merskiven, Rome's limited medical understanding, exposed disturbing truths. Physicians of the time wrote candidly about injuries suffered by young boys: anal tearing, infection, complications from castration. They documented suicide attempts among boys in wealthy households, quietly acknowledging the psychological torment. But this knowledge did not lead to reform or rescue. It led to more efficient control, better ways to preserve property, to keep the boys alive but not whole. Commodifying innocence. Boy concubines weren't just victims of desire, they were investments. Owners calculated their value with chilling precision: purchase price, training costs, grooming supplies, diet, control. Some owners even took out insurance policies on their most valuable boys. Ancient contracts remain dry legal texts documenting horrific realities. Each clause represents a life reduced to profit margins. A child whose worth was measured in pleasure, entertainment, and humiliation. These boys weren't hidden, they were paraded. At Saturnalia, the December festival of role reversal, some boy concubines were dressed in their master's robes and allowed to issue commands. A cruel parody, a single day of illusion, surrounded by a year of submission. At private banquets, they served wine, entertained guests, endured hands and comments without protest. Their humiliation wasn't an accident, it was part of the entertainment. Institutional complicity. No Roman institution stood innocent. The legal system codified their status as property. The military machine supplied a steady stream of child captives. The economy incentivized their trade. Even religious institutions, which might have offered moral clarity, were complicit. Many owned slaves themselves, including young boys, used for various purposes. The very institutions that upheld Roman greatness were soaked in childhood suffering. Christianity and cloaked abuse as the empire turned Christian under Emperor Constantine. Some reforms were introduced. Laws were passed attempting to regulate or restrict certain forms of slavery, but these reforms were selective, limited, and easily ignored. The abuse didn't end. It simply went underground. Now cloaked in the language of Christian morality, the trade in boys continued. Still bought, still sold, still violated, now under a banner of virtue. Spiritual trauma. Church fathers condemned pederasty, but not for the reasons we would hope. Their concern was mostly for the souls of the perpetrators, not the suffering of the victims. Boys who had been used and discarded were often seen as spiritually tainted, unfit for salvation unless they underwent lengthy, painful penance. The message was clear: your pain is your fault. Your trauma is a stain you must scrub clean. Their innocence was stolen. Then their souls were shamed for what was done to them. Collapse and abandonment. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as the Western Roman Empire began to collapse, the fate of boy concubines grew even more precarious. Economic instability left many masters unable to maintain large households. Some boys were sold into brothels for continued exploitation. Others were abandoned, left to fend for themselves in a society that had never treated them as human. A fortunate few were freed. But even freedom, after a life shaped entirely by servitude, was not liberation. Had no families to return to, no skills beyond those taught to please others, no identity that had not been shaped by pine. These boys were not myths, not metaphors, not artifacts. They were children with voices that were never heard, with names that were never recorded, with futures that were never allowed to exist. Their suffering was normalized, their trauma institutionalized, their humanity almost erased. But today, we remember them, not as property, not as legends, but as people. This is their story, and this is how we break the silence. A legacy of silence and shadows, abandoned, left to survive in a world that had no place for them. Some were sold to new masters in the Eastern Empire, where the practice quietly endured for centuries under Byzantine rule. The fall of Rome did not end the suffering. It simply changed its face. In the chaos of invasion and collapse, it is always the vulnerable who suffer first. And these boys, trained only for pleasure and submission, had few tools for survival. Many likely perished in the upheavals. Others may have been absorbed into new forms of servitude under Germanic warlords who adopted Roman customs. Their individual fates are lost to history, but we can imagine their fear, their loneliness, their despair. Lessons from a broken mirror. So, what can we, in our modern world, learn from this dark and buried chapter? First, we must recognize that power without accountability always leads to abuse. The Roman world gave slave owners total control over the lives of others, and that power corrupted completely. When a human life is labeled property, when suffering becomes a legally protected privilege of the elite, atrocities become routine. Second, we must see how entire societies can normalize evil through law, custom, and silence. The exploitation of these boys wasn't hidden in back rooms, it was displayed at dinner parties. celebrated in poetry, immortalized in marble and mosaic. An entire civilization convinced itself that the sexual abuse of children was not just acceptable, but cultured, refined, sophisticated. Let that be a warning about what we can justify when we blind ourselves to the suffering of others. Third, we must remember the victims, not as statistics, not as props in a tragic tale, but as real children with names we will never know, dreams we will never hear, and voices that were stolen 2,000 years ago. They loved, they feared, they hoped, they cried. Their humanity was denied by their world. But we must not repeat that denial. In remembering them, we restore, however, faintly a part of the dignity they were denied. The legacy of Rome's boy concubines did not die with the empire. It lived on. In Byzantium, in parts of the Islamic world, in powerful societies that pointed to Roman grandeur to justify their own abuses. Even now today across our world, children are still trafficked, still exploited, still treated as objects, to be used and discarded. The practices have changed. The technology has advanced. But the evil remains the same. The powerful preying on the vulnerable. Adults destroying childhoods. Human beings reduced to commodities. Understanding what was done in Rome is not about history, it's about awareness. Because we still live in a world shaped by those systems. We buy goods made by child laborers. We scroll past stories of abuse and exploitation. We look away, just as the Roman elite once did. We must ask, what suffering do we choose not to see? Today, the historian's burden of history itself has been complicit. For centuries, Roman scholars, almost entirely male, and aligned with the powerful, romanticized these practices. The story of Hadrian and Antinous was reframed as a tragic love story, not a tale of imbalance and exploitation. The suffering of thousands was glossed over, or erased. Only recently have historians begun to examine this past with the moral clarity it demands. Each inscription, each medical text, each slave contract adds another whisper to the chorus of the silenced. We cannot undo the suffering, but we can refuse to forget it. We can reject the urge to beautify it. We can name it for what it was: systematic child abuse, enshrined in one of history's most admired civilizations. A mirror and a choice. This isn't just about the past. It's a mirror held up to human nature. It shows us how easily ordinary people participate in barbarism, how suffering becomes background noise when comfort is at stake. Rome was advanced, brilliant, magnificent, and it was, at times, morally bankrupt. Yet even in this bleak history, there are seeds of hope. There were Romans who questioned the system, who freed their slaves, who saw the child behind the role. There were boys who survived, who held on to pieces of their identity through acts of inner resistance. And in their quiet endurance, we glimpse the resilience of the human spirit. This story hurts. It is not easy to hear. It is not meant to be, because when we confront this history, when we truly listen to the stories of the forgotten, we don't just mourn the past. We challenge the present, and we begin, slowly, to shape a more conscious future. Let us not flinch from these truths. Let us remember their names, even if the world forgot them. Let us choose, today, not to look away, because silence has always protected the powerful, but memory protects the weak.